Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you guys so much for joining us for part of our election series here at the Kentucky Chamber. I'm Ashley Watts. I'm the president and CEO, and we are very happy today to have Neil Bradley, who is the executive vice president and chief policy officer for the U.S. Chamber. For those that have been tuning into our webinars over the last couple of months, Neil is probably a familiar face, and he has been a great help to all of us here at the Kentucky Chamber and the businesses of Kentucky on looking at PPP loans and everything going on with COVID and the pandemic and a lot of the federal legislation. Before we get started, I do want to let everyone know about the next two webinars that we have with less than a month before of election. Hopefully you guys are not sick of talking about politics because we have a couple more programs to share with you. On October 20th, we have Senate Majority Leader Damon Thayer and Senate Minority Leader Morgan McGarvey, who are going to talk all about the state elections. So obviously today we're going to focus on the federal races and the presidency and the Supreme Court nomination and everything going on in DC. But on the 20th, we're really going to talk about the state legislative races that we have here in Kentucky. And then leading up into the election, we have kind of a fan favorite. On October 27th, we have KSR, Kentucky Sports Radio host Matt Jones, and CNN contributor and Run Switch founder Scott Jennings, who do a great back and forth. And our director of communications, Jacqueline Pitts, is going to be moderating both of those sessions. So make sure that you tune into those to get all the election scoop before Election Day. I do want to make the PSA that yesterday we started in-person voting here in Kentucky. So make sure that you are able to vote either before Election Day or Election Day. I think everything has been pretty easy so far. We're hearing the lines are moving quickly and it's a pretty seamless process. So make sure that you get your voice heard and go vote. And with that, welcome, Neil. Thank you for joining us again.
Well, thanks, Ashley. Thanks for having me. It's good to be back with you all. And I'm glad to hear that voting is getting off without a hitch there in Kentucky. So we thought we'd do two things today. One, and I'm just navigating to share my screen here, is that we'd walk through a little bit from the federal level some of the implications of the 2020 election and how we think about this in terms of the business community's priorities and what might be at stake here. And then I think we want to get to some of the questions now influenced by being, less than 3 weeks out from the election, how we see things going and how we see some of these late breaking events like the Supreme Court nomination playing into November 3rd's election. So we'll share these, by the way, with the team there at the Kentucky Chamber. I'm sure Ashley will pass them along for anyone who's interested. So don't worry about trying to grab screenshots or take notes, and some of this we'll walk through quickly. First, we'll start with a little background, and then we'll walk through what we've been walking through with our members at the U.S. Chamber, 3 scenarios that we are asked most frequently about. What we call a status quo scenario: President Trump wins re-election, Democrats maintain the House, Republicans maintain the Senate. Importantly, Mitch McConnell remains majority leader, something we're highly keen on at the U.S. Chamber. Secondly, a scenario where the Vice President Biden wins the White House, but the House and Senate remain their current status quo. And then 3, a shift in the White House and the Senate, resulting in unified Democratic government. I often hear everyone say, this is the most important election in our lifetime. And it feels like that we say that literally every 2 years now. And at first I thought, well, it's just cliche. And then we started thinking about kind of the history of federal elections. And there's actually a good reason people feel like that every election is the most consequential in their lifetime. As you all know, we have federal elections every 2 years. We're either having a presidential election or a midterm election. And so this chart shows every election from 1960 through the midterm 2 years ago. And if there's a circle around the election year, that means that that election resulted in a change in control in the House, the Senate, or the White House. And what change control is indicated by the letter, P for President, S for Senate, H for House. The colors differentiate whether the change in control resulted in unified government, blue for Democrats, unified government, red for Republicans, or divided government in the yellow. And we'll leave aside 2000's purple 50-50 Senate split that ended up being 3 majorities all in the span of a year there. The takeaway from this is between 1960 and the end of the 1990s, virtually every election did not result in a change in control in government. The status quo, whatever it was at that moment in time, was stable for a significant period. If you go from 2000 to 2018, it's the exact opposite. All but 2 elections resulted in a change in control in either the House, the Senate, or the White House. So if you believe that policy is going to fundamentally change if one party or the other gets control, and every election is producing a change in control, every election is the most consequential in our lifetime. And notably, these tend to produce more brief periods of unified government. 2002 for Republicans, 2008 for Democrats, 2016 for Republicans. Again, but they happen to be very short, brief periods, which means that there is often this pent-up demand from divided government that gets expressed in a huge policy shift during periods of unified government. In fact, unified government historically produces big legislation. If you go back to the first 2 years of Bill Clinton's first term in office, the Family Medical Leave Act, the Brady gun laws, NAFTA, deficit reduction were all done then. In the 5 months before Jim Jeffords switched parties in 2001, George W. Bush got his first tax cut bill through. Then reclaiming the majority in 2003 and 4, the 2003 tax bill, Medicare prescription drugs. You see what they continued in that next term. Of course, the first 2 years of Obama were unified Democratic government, and that resulted in the stimulus and Obamacare and Dodd-Frank, and obviously tax reform, most notably in the first 2 years of President Trump's administration. One of the reasons that that list is not longer is because of the filibuster in the Senate. The filibuster applies at the moment in time to non-budgetary legislative matters done outside of reconciliation. And it requires 60 votes. And it means that a lot of things, even in unified government that can get through the House of Representatives, simply can't get 60 votes in the Senate. That's even true when the same party controls both the House and the Senate. But many of us are wondering about the future of the filibuster. Here you see that the first change in the filibuster was for reconciliation in the mid-70s. Then we had the deterioration of the filibuster for nominations. There was an effort at that in 2005 when Republicans were in control that a bipartisan group pushed back on and maintained the filibuster. Then, of course, Harry Reid famously changed the filibuster rules for everything other than Supreme Court nominees. And then Mitch McConnell said, you're going to regret this. And sure enough, in 2017, the Republicans changed it for Supreme Court nominations. I think it's fair to say that it is difficult, and I don't say this is a partisan matter, but in the next unified government of either party, the pressure to get rid of the filibuster is intense. And you're seeing that right now on the Democratic side with talks of removing the filibuster should they get unified government. Of course, a lot of policy is made outside of Congress, and it's made through regulations. In addition to tax reform, one of the bright spots of the Trump administration's policies have been their deregulatory nature. They don't really need Congress to write regulations. They can do it on their own. But part of the downside of that is that it's easy to reverse what's done. You know, Barack Obama, after losing control of Congress, his party losing control of Congress, famously said, I got a pen and I got a phone, which is his way of saying, I'm going to do what I want through executive orders and regulations. That was fine, except it turned out that Donald Trump had the exact same pen, the exact same phone. He said, everything that you did, I'm going to undo. Well, of course, the next Democratic administration, whether it's Joe Biden next year or someone else 4 or 8 years from now, is going to have the exact same powers. And so there are some things that are super easy to undo, like executive orders, and things that are harder to do, things that have been finalized as final rules and regulations. But even those, a determined administration, 18 months roughly, and you can undo anything you want to undo from a prior administration. Of course, we also think about this increasingly in terms of state governments, and obviously we have a lot of state elections on the ballot, which I know you're talking about next week there in Kentucky with your legislature. But state governments, frankly, are as polarized as Washington is. We think Washington's the problem. Washington is polarized. Well, it wasn't that long ago, 20 years ago, where the norm is that most Americans lived in a state with a government that looks like Kentucky's today, divided control. Legislature maybe of one party, a governor of another party, maybe even split control within the legislature. Today, you're the exception, not the norm. 21 states are unified Republican control, 15 states are unified Democratic control, and 13 are split control. Interestingly, by the way, for those doing math, there's one state missing. That's Nebraska. Nebraska is technically nonpartisan unicameral legislature. So they're kind of the we can't call it the elephant or the donkey. I don't know what you want to call that, but they're the unicorn in our 50 states. And by the way, of these, there's exactly one of our 50 state legislatures that isn't single party control, and that's Minnesota. They have Republicans who control the Senate and Democrats who control the House there. 2 seats are away from that being unified control, and I suspect if we were visiting a month from now, we would say that it's possible that there's not a single legislature that's divided control. You all know the states and kind of where folks lie. By the way, from a business community perspective, if you think about consumer brands and major companies, it's about evenly split. Republican states have more population, but Democrat states have slightly more private employment, more consumer spending, and more GDP. This is obviously anchored by California and New York, and the fact that we have smaller red states and bigger blue states, at the moment. By the way, you all have a great new attorney general who's getting a lot of attention, and attorney generals become really important in periods of divided government. So if you go all the way back to the Reagan years, attorney general positions were pretty sleepy when it came to federal policy. They may have all wanted to be governor. I think that's been true since, 200 years ago, since the position of attorney generals were created. But in terms of federal policy, they didn't play a lot. And this chart represents multi-state lawsuits where attorney generals are stepping up and challenging the federal government. That began to change during the George W. Bush administration, where attorneys generals began banding together by party, with the party opposite the president routinely challenging the actions of the administration of the opposite party. That accelerated Obama and has exploded under Trump. I was in Pennsylvania recently, and I think the attorney general is running for re-election in the Commonwealth there on the basis of how many times he sued Donald Trump. Not what he's done for Pennsylvania, but how much he's done to sue the Trump administration. So with that kind of background, let's walk through the 3 quick scenarios. Trump wins, Congress stays status quo. This is perhaps the easiest to think through. It simply is policy continuation. The path that the president has set on the deregulatory efforts will continue and run apace. Nancy Pelosi and Leader McConnell and President Trump aren't likely to magically start getting along any better than they do now. I don't expect Bonhominy to take over and them to solve all the issues that they couldn't agree on before. It also means, because nature abhors a vacuum, that policy will move to states, particularly those states that are blue, party opposite the president, who will try to legislate nationally in place of the federal government. You see this most notably with California. They would like to write the rules of the road. They don't really care what people in Frankfurt think. They don't care what people in Oklahoma City think. They don't care what anyone else thinks. They want to write the rules for the rest of the nation on data privacy and labor laws, and they're frankly doing a good job at that. Any president who gets reelected is emboldened. I think that's especially true of Donald Trump. He's going to be emboldened at home and abroad. When we think of 2021, 22, there's just a lot of regulatory work that's going to be done, a lot more use of executive actions, many on things we agree with, some on things we don't agree with, like immigration and trade. Heavy focus in foreign affairs, as there tend to be in a president's second term. China, a UK trade deal, Iran, and obviously that state level action that I mentioned there before. The second scenario, quickly, Biden wins, Congress remains status quo. I talked about the pen and the phone. So Joe Biden won't have the Senate to do what he wants. So he's going to have to rely on that pen and phone. Aggressive regulatory action focused on undoing Trump's. Legislative gridlock is, I assume, likely to continue. I don't think Mitch McConnell is going to be endorsing a President Biden's legislative agenda. It'll be interesting how this plays out in terms of nominations, and it's a question mark on how what President Biden, how he would work with the Senate to fill vacancies. That also means, by the way, sub-cabinet level things become really important. Unable to make policy, chief executives, presidents tend to rely on things that they can control. They are the chief law enforcement officer, so they can use enforcement of existing law as kind of a policy tool. You saw this at the very end of the Obama administration on the theory that the Obama administration should have been going heavy after the heads of banks for the 2008 downturn, and just a kind of a focus of using the DOJ as a policy tool. Procurement also becomes a policy tool. The government buys a lot of goods and services, and there's the ability to say, well, if you want to do business with the government, here are the rules that I'm going to write for you. Blue states remain active here, and your attorney general, I suspect, will become an active part along with other AGs in pushing back on some of the excesses from the points above. The regulations will be reversed. There's 82 that are on the books right now that he could undo like that. There's going to be a lot of new executive orders. Vice President Biden has a fairly detailed policy agenda that lays out all kinds of things. When you pull it all together, it's all over the place in terms of where you find it. When you pull it all together, his first 100-day promises includes executive actions on climate and clean energy, 13 separate proposals that he says he's going to do. Immigration, there are 15. Supply chain, Buy America, 3. So a lot of heavy executive action there. I mentioned procurement, enforcement, blue state. You kind of get the sense there. Some of the things that we'll be thinking about on the policy framework. Immigration will become a key issue with President Biden going the other direction. And what DOL does in regulating wage and employment and OSHA and labor unions, all of those things will come to the fore. Antitrust, mergers and acquisitions, scrutiny of arbitration agreements. Those are kind of things that an executive branch under President Biden would be focused on. Lots of the regulatory reforms that we've achieved the last 4 years would be reversed on the tax side, on access to capital issues, infrastructure, environment, using the power of the federal government to regulate, to mandate clean energy from government contractors, to regulate fracking on public lands, are the type of things that we would expect. Enforcement policies on new technology will become a big issue. Healthcare, he'll probably continue in the same vein as President Trump on price controls on pharmaceuticals, et cetera. But obviously the ACA would become more stabilized under this environment. Trade, I often get asked about China. I think China is going to be a tension point no matter who wins, because the problems with China are real and they're recognized on a bipartisan basis. President Biden would take a more multilateral approach rather than a bilateral approach. Finally, we'll quickly go to a unified democratic government. Um, Here, our operating assumption is the filibuster is repealed. That means it only takes 51 votes in the Senate to pass something. That enables a maximalist agenda. A Biden administration would still use the aggressive regulatory action. Enforcement would be the same. By the way, Congress has lots of oversight capabilities. Congress tends to only use those against an administration when the administration's of the opposite party. When they're of the same party, they have to go find someone else to investigate because they don't want to investigate their political colleagues. So they tend to, often in a democratic unified government, look to the business sector. Again, GOP attorney generals become super important in this scenario as well, challenging not just regulatory actions, but legislative actions. Things we're worried about: PRO Act, card check, paid leave, revising the antitrust laws for the first time in 100 years, undoing the 2017 tax bill, carbon pricing and emissions mandates, restrictions on energy production, California-style data privacy, net neutrality rules, redefinition of everyone who's an independent contractor as an employee, Medicare buy-in, a big Social Security tax increase. Folks aren't paying attention to that as part of Biden's proposals, but he has a big one and it's in there, and he's got a support of the majority of the members of the House of Representatives to get it done. Buy America sanctions become part of it as well. So big differences between whether Mitch McConnell remains leader or he doesn't remain leader in terms of what can happen, which is why a big part of our focus at the U.S. Chamber is making sure that there's the support there for the majority leader to remain the majority leader. We'll also share with you, by the way, I mentioned that Vice President Biden has a lot online. Our team has pulled that together. No commentary from us. We've just scraped it together, make it searchable. We'll make that available to all of you as a tool in case that's helpful. So that's a little bit of what's on the line and why this election might be the most important in our lifetime without exaggeration. And let's get into some of the questions and how the election looks.
Great. Thank you, Neil. And that was very informative. I think many of us wonder the different scenarios and what's going to happen and what policy positions are at stake. Sometimes things get so heated politically, we forget to talk about the policies that are attached to the various political parties. So I'm not going to ask you to kind of look into the crystal ball and let us know what you're thinking, but I do want to talk about polling a little bit. So I think where you left off kind of with the various scenarios is a good segue into polling. And so we know in the last couple of election cycles, even here in Kentucky, polling has been off. The polling does show, I mean, I think pretty much everyone agrees, the polling shows Biden pretty far ahead nationally. Now, of course, we know that's a little different than in the swing states and electoral college. What is the U.S. Chamber's thoughts on the polling, and do you think that the polling is more accurate right now than it was maybe 4 years ago?
I do think the polling is more accurate than it was 4 years ago. It's not so much that everyone says, well, people want to attribute it to folks won't be honest when a pollster reaches them. They're embarrassed to admit they support the president. There's very little evidence for that. And by the way, there's very little evidence for that even within polls, right? So someone who says, might not want to admit that they support President Trump, that won't normally extend down ballot. And so you would see under ballot races performing better than the president. That's not what we're seeing. And so the real issue, rather than shyness about one's views on the president, really has to do with your assumptions of what the electorate looks like. And that was what was so wrong in 2016 in some of these swing states, is that the models didn't accurately pick up the number of non-college educated, particularly white voters, who were a key constituencies in Trump's base and overperformed the models. I think they've adjusted that, and for many of these polls, doesn't mean that they have it perfect, but I don't think there's a reason to assume that the polls are fundamentally wrong this time, particularly given, and by the way, you never can prove this till election day, but one thing you can do is say, well, gosh, what do the campaigns believe about the polls? And the fact that Trump in the next week is going to be in Georgia and Iowa tells you a little bit about that their reading of the polls, even their own polls, tells you that places that they had easily locked down 4 years ago, they feel the need to go spend time in today.
And thinking about those places like Georgia and Iowa and the swing states, how is the polling looking in those states? I mean, is there kind of a clear trend? Are they split? Are they so close that we're not going to be able to tell? I think we all hear from the news kind of the polling is showing Biden ahead in many of the swing states, but what are your all's thoughts on that?
Yeah, so we kind of group these together. We have what used to be the Democratic firewall, Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania. Obviously, the president winning those is what enabled him to win the election 4 years ago. Florida, where because if Florida goes to Biden, it's really impossible to figure out how Trump assembles 270 votes. And then you have this kind of constellation of other states where Arizona, for example, Iowa, where Biden thinks they might have a chance. Initially, Minnesota and Nevada, where Trump thought that they might have a chance. What we're seeing is a real jump ball in Florida, and really difficult to predict either way how that goes. But we're looking at Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania, where Biden certainly has a leads that are beyond the margin of error. He's not above 50% generally. If he was above 50%, I think folks would have a differing view of this. And that the states that Trump had hoped to pull into play, Minnesota, Nevada in particular, have not, while Arizona and Iowa have moved into play for the Democrats. So the former vice president is playing at the moment, and it's 20 days away, is playing with a bigger playing field than the president is.
And what have them. And I'm always curious about the swing states. Kentucky, right now is not really a swing state, even though we're purple. We're kind of an anomaly in that sense. What is kind of the swing voter look like, or what are their concerns? I know we read a lot about Trump has lost support among some women over the last 4 years. Is there a trend in some of these swing states as to why voters have gone one way to the other in 4 years?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of attention paid. There's a lot of attention paid to women. That does not seem the polling that is a definitive advantage for Vice President Biden. It does not seem to wholly represent the change from 4 years ago. In fact, a bigger contributor to the change from 4 years ago, and remember, we're talking about a change in which Hillary Clinton won the popular vote. She just lost the Electoral College. And so the slippage that you've seen from 4 years ago today is really in men, in college-educated voters, particularly male college-educated voters, and also of recent a slippage in seniors. And so, if you look at the gender gap today, we were looking at these numbers this morning, averaging out some polls, et cetera. Vice President Biden leads among women by 16 points. Trump's margin among men is only 4 points, much narrower than he was 4 years ago. Interestingly, among college-educated white voters, men and women, Biden leads by 21 points. Trump's base is that non-college educated white voter, where he leads by 26 points.
Great. And we had a question, this was actually on my list to ask. Obviously, we are home to Leader McConnell, and so he does have a race coming up in a couple weeks. I mean, his polling is looking good here in Kentucky, but obviously there are many seats up in the Senate right now that could potentially flip. That's a big conversation of whether the Republicans can keep control of the Senate, and you've mentioned that. Talk about some of the key races that are going to determine whether the Senate flips. I know there's Arizona, I think North Carolina, a couple others. So walk us through maybe a couple of those key Senate races that you guys are following.
Yeah, so let's start with the current makeup. Republicans have 53 of our 100 Senate seats. It's what makes the leader the majority leader. Um, the map, and when we say map, it's where are the third of Senates, every 2 years we elect a third of the senators. From which states are that third that's up in this class from? And it's a map that tends to overwhelmingly favor Democrats. Republicans have one clear pickup. That's in Alabama. Doug Jones is a Democrat. You may remember Roy Moore and
Yeah.
his problems, and that Doug Jones, a Democrat, beat Roy Moore. He's now up for election for a full term. Coach Tuberville is going to win that seat.
Mm-hmm.
So if you start there, Republicans have 54 seats in the next Congress. The problem is that the seats that they're defending, and I'll give them to you kind of in order, and you can begin to see the danger zone that Republicans are in. Let's start with Colorado. Cory Gardner, phenomenal candidate, great senator. Colorado's just went from purple to blue and has kind of remained blue. And the latest polling is that he's down by 9 points. If you go to Arizona, mentioned Martha McSally. McSally actually lost a Senate race 2 years ago. She got appointed to the vacant John McCain seat. Now she's running again. She's running against a former astronaut, the husband of former Representative Gabby Giffords, who was tragically shot. She's down by 8 points. If you go to Iowa, by the way, 8 and 9 points are well beyond the margin of error.
Right.
They're not above 50 yet, but they're right like 49.6, 49.4. They are close. If you go to Iowa, Joni Ernst is currently down in the average of polls 4.8. So that takes you to 51. So then you're looking at some of the other seats. North Carolina, Tom Tillis. Everyone has been watching in the past week for this race to shift. Tillis has been trailing all summer to Cunningham. You saw some personal scandals.
There's some news last week about Cunningham.
And everyone has been watching the polling to see if that tightened the race significantly or created a lead for Tillis. The last couple of polls that have been in the field since the news broke and completed continue to show a lead for Cunningham. Narrowed, but it's still 4.3 on average. Susan Collins in Maine, she is the last Republican in the Northeast. They're going to spend something like $80 million in Maine. They could just write everyone a check at this point. Given how much money, and we're spending money in Maine as the U.S. Chamber. We're spending money in a lot of these places. But Collins, if anyone can win that, it's her, but she's currently down, about 3 points. And then the surprise that no one was counting on is South Carolina. Lindsey Graham, in the most recent poll that just came out, which replicated 3 other polls from last month, is dead even, 48-48. And so Republicans can stand to lose a few of those. They can't lose all of them. Mm-hmm. And then the problem is that there are more on the watch list. Montana, right before we joined, I just saw a new poll out of Montana. The Republican is down by 2 points, within the margin of error, so I wouldn't think too much about it, but worrisome. A new poll just came out from Quinnipiac this afternoon in Georgia with Senator Perdue, a Republican, down. Republicans have now just invested about $5 million in Alaska to shore up the incumbent Republican there. So similar to the presidential level, the playing field is just one where Republicans are on defense. The one offensive pickup was put in the bank so long ago that everything else is focused on defense.
Wow, great. And one question I always have is, especially around debate time, You see people on the news that are the undecided voters. And I always think for any of us that kind of live and breathe this stuff, it's always funny 3 weeks before that there are still some people undecided at this point. What is the undecided voter looking for? Have you guys looked into that? Is it economics? Is it social issues? What exactly is kind of that unicorn undecided voter that could be swung one way or the other looking for in this election cycle?
So one of the things that helped President Trump, who not helped him, it's the reason he won 4 years ago, is that there are a group of voters who didn't like Hillary Clinton and they didn't like Donald Trump. And they were going to vote and they couldn't decide which one they disliked the least. And, the news cycle and some of those things broke in such a way that if you disliked both candidates, you were more likely on election day to vote for Donald Trump. And he won the contest among the voters who said a pox on all of your houses, and who actually meant a pox on all of your houses. And we all say that we don't like politicians. These voters actually meant it, and they didn't really want to vote for either one of them. You have some element of that today. Biden is more likable than Hillary Clinton was, and so there are fewer of those voters. But there are voters who may not like the president, but they're not sure based on either policy issues that I walked through. They're not sure about his ability, and they're waiting not so much for a piece of information, but just for that sense of feeling of, yeah, okay, I dislike this one the least, and they're going to get my vote.
Got it. And I know in DC right now, you guys are probably all encompassed with the Supreme Court nomination. Many of us have been watching it on TV the last couple of days. And I think for President Trump and Republicans, they see this as kind of a leg up on their side. Of course, Democrats are not wanting it to go through until after the election. Tell us a little bit about, I know the U.S. Chamber has done extensive research on Judge Amy Coney Barrett's nomination and her history and her judicial kind of expertise. What are your all's thoughts on her nomination? I'm not exactly talking about the process, but on her as a jurist. And then really, I kind of want to hear from you, which side do you think this benefits? Kind of pushing this through the last couple of weeks of the election. In the Senate, obviously they have the votes. You mentioned Senator Collins in Maine. I think she has said she's not going to. Maybe I forget who other. I don't know if it was. So I mean, they have the votes to get it through, and so it does look like she will be confirmed. What do you think are the outcomes of this, and does it impact the election in a couple weeks?
Well, first, for anyone who's watched any bit of, we'll leave aside the first day of opening statements when we just heard from senators, not especially enlightening. But yesterday and today, Judge Barrett in the questioning, she's clearly a brilliant jurist. I mean, we know academically was at the top of her class and all of those things. And, you don't have to spend much time watching to go, yep, that sounds exactly right.
And unlike me, she doesn't use notes.
Exactly, the blank pad of paper, which has been turned into some great memes on Twitter. Yeah. Yes, so it was perfect for our social media age. Our team at the Chamber, and we have a whole litigation division. We currently have 5 former Supreme Court clerks. We actually have someone on staff who was a student of Judge Barrett's when she was at Notre Dame. We have some of her fellow clerk alumni from Justice Scalia. And they did go through and review. And the important thing is that we don't really look and say, well, gosh, here's a pro-business judge versus an anti-business judge. The truth is it depends on the issue. And sometimes even Justice Scalia ruled against the positions that we have in the chamber. By the way, as he often said, if sometimes the law doesn't compel you to reach a decision with which you personally disagree, then you're doing it wrong. And so thankfully, we're not judges, so we just get to focus on what we personally agree with or what we think is best for the business community. But the most important thing is there a fair shake? And does a judge treat litigants fairly? Are they guided by the Constitution, by the law, and by the arguments presented to them? We file frequently in front of the Supreme Court. Our goal is let us make what we think are our best arguments, and rule based on the arguments that we present and the arguments that whoever is opposing presents. And she has a track record of that. And so I think not only do I think she will be confirmed, as you said, I think she deserves to be confirmed. And as someone said in a prior time, she would get 80, 90 votes in the U.S. Senate, and no one would think twice that was an appropriate outcome. In terms of the politics of this, the biggest danger all along, I think, when this was set up was that one side or the other overreached, that there was a moment that the arguments either became too personal, or it would appear that proponents were overlooking facts in a sense of trying to rush to get it done. I think the way this is played out, while unfortunate that it's so partisan in nature, I think it's demonstrated Republicans doing due diligence and pressing on issues and elevating it. And at the moment, Democrats haven't seemed to overreach in the way they did with Justice Kavanaugh in a way that backfired. So I'm not sure that this moves the needle one way or the other. I think it kind of is like everyone goes, yeah, everyone did what they were kind of supposed to do, and they didn't fundamentally change the dynamic.
And one thing that's been interesting, and we'll kind of wrap up with this because I do think it's kind of the most pressing thing going on is the confirmation. And we're hearing a lot about stacking the court, which, a couple months ago, probably no one really talked about. And now all of a sudden we're hearing if Biden becomes president, there is a possibility that he could add seats to the Supreme Court. He has been asked this question a couple times. He will not give a definitive answer. And so I've been very curious, and I've done a little bit of research on how this practically would be into effect. Obviously it would have to have approval through Congress. But have you guys kind of figured out the steps of if this were to happen? Obviously, this has not happened in, I don't know the last time this has happened. I think it happened once before. A little bit of history about that and how a Biden presidency could see that happen.
Yeah, so let's start with the mechanics of it. The number of Supreme Court justices is not fixed in the Constitution. Mm-hmm. We've had 5, we've had 6. Kind of weird we'd have an even number. We've had 7, we've had 9 for well over, I guess, coming up on almost a century and a half now, of 9 justices. The last time that this was seriously contemplated was FDR during the New Deal. The court had struck down quite a few of the New Deal measures that Congress had passed, and FDR had signed into law. FDR was frustrated by this. He proposed a plan to add new seats to the court for every justice who was over the age of, I believe, 80 at the time. His party, Democrats, were in control of Congress. There was a pretty massive backlash on this, and it did not end up happening. It did not go through. In terms of how it would happen, it's a simple statute change. So Congress passes a law, the president signs it, saying that the number of Supreme Court justices is X, and whatever they say it is, once that becomes law, those seats are obviously vacant, and a president would nominate, and the Senate would confirm justices to that vacancy.
Interesting. So it is a fairly easy process if the Senate were to flip and there was a Biden presidency. I know a lot of people—
And no filibuster.
And no filibuster. People have said, is it in the Constitution? Obviously, that would take states to kind of take it up as well. It does not have that. So it'll be interesting to see how this shakes out. One last question before we end, because I know this is what you and the U.S. Chamber have been working on for the last 7 months. We are still here 7 months later, is really COVID relief. And you guys have been so instrumental in the CARES Act and then the other bills that have come forward, and really making sure that the flag was held high on legal liability reforms and PPP loans and all of that. And you've been a great voice for all the businesses across the U.S. and and here in Kentucky. We kind of know now that the president has said he does not think another COVID relief package will happen before the election. I know Leader McConnell, I think yesterday, said, well, maybe we could do a couple parts of it before, and the Senate was going to take that up. Do you think that this is a possibility, maybe not even before the election, but in the kind of lame duck session? And by President Trump saying we're not going to take up another COVID relief package, does that hurt his chances or the Republican Party?
So I don't think a COVID relief package can get enacted before Election Day. Leader McConnell has said he'll take up a vote next week on a airlines and PPP for small business package. The Democrats have already said they will block that. It's going to look a lot like the last vote that the Senate had. There is no room for kind of a big deal at the moment. Post-election, I think it's going to depend on the election outcome. I think if President Trump were to lose re-election, he would either decide that he would have to decide that as kind of one of his last acts, he wanted to complete, a recovery package. I think Democrats would be pretty tempted to hold over until President Biden was sworn in. By the way, that looks exactly like what happened in 2008, right? Mm-hmm. Beginning of the Great Recession, election, Obama wins. The first order of business for an Obama and a unified Democratic Congress was the stimulus bill. Mm-hmm. So if you felt like you've seen this movie before, you may have.
It's always a pendulum.
It is always
repeats itself.
It's always a pendulum. I think the president, when he tweeted that he called off his negotiations, I think he did hurt himself. I think that's why he reversed course and then called for an even bigger deal than what Democrats wanted. But it's become so muddled at this point that no one can keep track of who's where. I personally feel like this is a moment. We talked about those voters who say a pox on all your houses. I actually think that there's a legitimate reason to be mad at everybody in this process. That the failure to find compromise, and not that they couldn't find compromise in the month of October preceding an election. They've had 4 months.
Right.
This should have come together, and what we're most worried about, for those of you who kind of follow international news, what's happening in Europe right now with the second wave, with spike in hospitalizations, with new closures. We're beginning to see inklings of that in a number of U.S. states. And, our big fear is that we follow that path here in the United States. And, we can't afford that from a health perspective, but we can't afford from a business perspective, right, the kind of lockdowns. And so, that's the real concern at the moment. And the reason that at least some underlying level of support, if it could have been enacted, could help us weather, the combination of a flu season and a second.
Mm-hmm. Maybe get us through until there is a vaccine in the next 6 months or so.
That's right.
Neil, thank you so much. I always love talking with you about politics and everything going on at the federal level. And for everyone watching, you can see why the U.S. Chamber is such a wonderful resource for us here at the Kentucky Chamber. They have their thumb on everything going on at the federal level. Anytime that we have any questions about any of those races or how things are going to go, they're always there to help and give advice and really just be a wonderful resource to us. So thank you, Neil. Good luck in the next couple of weeks. And with the election, I told him earlier, I hope hope he takes a much deserved vacation after Election Day, because you definitely deserve it. But thank you, and let us know how we can be of assistance to you here in Kentucky. And thank you all to who are viewing this afternoon, and make sure to tune in to our next 2 webinars in our election series, really focusing on the state, House, and Senate races, and then our last one with Scott Jennings and Matt Jones. So please feel free to reach out to any of us at the Chamber if you have any questions, and we look forward to talking to you soon. Thank you all.